Just the other day, I read an article which said that Percy Jackson, with 3 billion minutes watched, was the highest ranked show in terms of viewership on all of Disney Plus over the course of 2024. As a pretty big fan of the franchise itself, this made me very happy. After all, right from the get-go, even before Disney bought Fox and got their hands on the rights to the series, I was so sure a TV show could actually do some big business. Granted, at the time I thought a live-action adaptation would be a bit of a failure, and that they should make an animated show in the vein of Clash of the Titans. Anybody else remember that show? Classic. So granted, this news does show that I was wrong to worry about the overall success of a live-action Percy Jackson. As here it is, it's a big hit for Disney. I would have to assume that it's come in over what they expected, and that it was not as expensive to make as your Star Wars types. Hence why The Acolyte was cancelled with not much less viewership, and Percy Jackson gets a season 2. Let's hope they maintain this going into the next season though. I'm thinking we're probably going to be looking at a release date of early 2026 maybe. Either way, it's not going to be anytime soon. Minimum 2 years seems to be the overall trend for these types of shows at this point. It's an industry-wide thing, and sadly I don't think it's ever going to change. The days of yearly seasons is becoming a bygone era for anything outside of soaps and procedural drama type shows. Big budget TV, especially with bigger name actors with busy schedules, are the way of the future. Now I'm sad. Anyway, no time to dwell on that now. When we came into the show, I think it was clear to everybody there was going to be some changes to the source material. It just feels obvious. There were some changes I liked, and some changes I didn't. For instance, I liked that they really fleshed out that big brother vibe for Luke and his bond with Percy. It made that betrayal at the end hit harder and feel way sadder. On the other hand, it felt like they moved away from some of the goofier stuff that made the world feel unique in favour of a blander, more generic fantasy world. For instance, the underworld, Charon, who knows. In this version is a very, ooh, I'm spooky, ooh, you're not dead type of character. In the book though, he's more of a disgruntled, overworked minor god who's become addicted to high fashion and Italian suits and asks Percy and the gang to speak to Hades to get him a raise. I prefer that sort of thing. Shows the world's moving on. On top of that, you have stuff like the Lotus Casino, which felt way cooler and more mysterious and scary in the book than it does in the show, where it's rather generic and very easily dealt with. So there are good parts and bad parts to everything. One of the changes I felt on the fence about for quite a while is the characterization of Sally Jackson, because her portrayal in the book is significantly at odds with her character in the TV show, to the point that it feels like a completely different person. I think the fandom as a whole has been a little bit mixed on the character for the most part. On one hand, you have the people that think it was for the best that they took her story in a fresh direction, as it wasn't necessarily something you want to see in a kid's show. On the other hand, you have people that think it should have been left as is, as it was a pretty important plot point overall. As for me, which camp am I in? I don't know. I do remember thinking it was a very big change at the time of release, and that there was a big difference in her character, but it never really bothered me too much. That being said though, I've been thinking more and more about it, and I just did a rewatch, so I wanted to give my finalised thoughts on the characterisation of Sally Jackson over the course of Season 1, and whether it was an upgrade or a downgrade from her personality in the book series. I suppose to start, we'd simply better discuss the actual difference in her characterisation. We'll start with book Sally. Simply put, in the book, Sally feels like a far more passive character. Not that she's weak or anything of the sort, and she goes out of her way to keep Percy safe as much as she can, much like in the show. It's simply done in a different way to what we've seen. Here, she's with Gabe overtly because the dude smells bad. So bad that monsters are going to be thrown off Percy's scent. As opposed to just being a general loser like in the show, in the book, the dude is legitimately a huge piece of shit. He's verbally and physically abusive to Sally, and she largely just has to take it from him. On top of that, she's very sweet and gentle with Percy, and willingly sacrifices herself in this way. It's something that as a younger reader you gloss over, and maybe it makes you feel a bit bad, but once you get that Gabe catharsis of her killing him and selling him as a garden statue, you move on from it. As an adult looking back though, it has me going, oh shit, that's dark, Rick. Very dark. It's honestly such a sad fate. In Percy's memories though, there's just a lot of light and love surrounding his relationship with his mother. That's the focus. Beyond that, I feel like her importance to the overall story and Percy's personal development as a character is lesser than in the show. Season 1 though presents things rather differently. For starters, the way they present her dynamic with Gabe was completely different. Instead of being a piece of shit abuser, he's a freeloading no-hoper, who Percy and Sally seem to find more annoying and pathetic than anything else. I don't think they ever really mention him smelling bad, and at times Sally does seem like she's somewhat fond of him, as they both mention enjoying watching sports together. I think it was the Knicks. Probably met him at a game, honestly. She's not getting slapped around, and she isn't suffering in the same way. Instead, her arc's presented as a woman who's struggling with the idea of her son being a demigod. Her having to let him go and him leaving her behind to join this world that she can't be a part of and she's afraid could destroy him or change him into somebody she can no longer recognize. She has far more of a sharp personality, judging by her dynamics with Grover and with Gabe and even with Percy at times. There's still that love and compassion, but it is tempered with steel. And as Percy goes on his journey to save her and stop the potential war between the gods, we start to see some of her struggles and pain firsthand via flashback. How she clearly found being a single mum to a demigod extremely difficult and was often forced to make hard choices that hurt both her and Percy in the moment, but she felt like were for the best. Like sending him to a boarding school outside the city that would be more equipped for his needs and would keep him safe and away from monsters. Is it ever explained how that works, why they couldn't just track him to the school? Or like forcing him to learn to swim and be comfortable in and with the water, as one day it would be important, despite his protests. They just showed a lot more of her personal struggle and her frustration, which differs quite a lot from what we saw in the book. So I guess this brings me to my perspective. Is this a good change or a bad change, or does it sit somewhere on the spectrum? We can start with the whole dynamic with Gabe. This, in my eyes, is one of the best changes the show's undertaken. I feel like kids/young adults books, particularly from the 90s to 2000s, specifically underplay the truly long-lasting and expansive trauma that an abused person's going to experience. It's the Harry Potter effect. That kid was locked in a cupboard from a young age with no friends, no loved ones or compassion to speak of, and yet despite some anger issues, the dude's just kind of fine. Same concept here. In the book, Sally's clearly a battered wife. She's emotionally and physically abused. Gabe is described as being disgusting. So disgusting, monsters will steer clear. She doesn't love him. She doesn't like him. She hates him. Hates him to the point that she doesn't want to divorce him. She wants to kill him. Fair enough, really. Read between the lines and you arrive at things like, realistically, marital rape, I'm sorry to say. None of that makes her a weak character, by the way. But the reveal that she does it all for Percy forever just puts this sad, dark cloud over the story that I don't think you get past in the show. It's truly awful. I feel like everybody involved in writing this first season probably realized that too. So the pivot from her being dominated by this cruel, horrific man to her tolerating this cringy freeloader who neither her or Percy respect much is a better change. It makes it kind of funny rather than sad, and shifts the focus over onto Percy and her, and away from this guy who has no real relevance to the story once the first arc ends. Simply put, this just isn't what people want to see. I very much like this change, although I think it was a bit harsh to kill off Gabe at the end of the season. I think it would have been funny to have him make a cameo every now and then if a character's in New York City. Anyway, another point in favour of the change is that since Poseidon clearly does somewhat keep watch over Percy based on dialogue and whatnot, I reckon that if somebody was treating Sally and Percy this badly, a watery hand is going to rise up out of the toilet and strangle this guy to death. Gods in this world are famously bad-tempered. Gabe would have no chance in hell. You know what I mean? I just don't see it. It doesn't really gel with the world they set up, and so it's for the best they dial back on that type of thing. That was probably my most positive change that they made to her character for the show. The other big change is her relationship with Percy. When we first meet the pair, they do seem very similar to their dynamic in the book. Sally gets him the blue food, she cares about him, believes what he has to say over the words of the school headmaster, etc, etc. She trusts him, she loves him, she teaches him and guides him. All very good stuff. They have a very close bond and she can be ferocious in her protection of him. Poor old Grover cops it a few times in that first episode alone. So far, so good. They've combined their close relationship from the book alongside this new show thing where she butts heads with Gabe and has a very strong personality. I'm sure some people are upset she was a bit rough on Grover, but here it's a natural continuation of the previous dynamic shift and keeps the OG bond with Percy strong. I liked it, and I think a lot of people rather like this change. I'm sure there are purists out there, but for the most part I think it can be acknowledged that this was the right move. She then gets taken by the Minotaur and saved by Hades, and Percy has to go to try to rescue her whilst also trying to stop the budding war between Zeus and Poseidon by finding and returning Zeus's lightning bolt. Now along the way, through Percy flashback, we see that perhaps their relationship wasn't always quite as positive as we were led to believe. There are two major instances where this happens. Hermes starts to force Percy to relive some traumatic memories because he randomly decides to be a bit of a dick in that moment. There's also some water-based flashback sequences from when he starts to unlock some of his godly powers. Here is where I think the opinions start to become more mixed from what I've seen at the very least. In the flashback at the pool, young Percy is extremely frightened of the water to the point that he doesn't want to do the swimming lessons at all. Sally in this moment yells at him and starts to get very frustrated and overwhelmed, which is a running theme in this version of her character. One of the big sticking points is that 1, they've already paid for the lessons, and 2, he needs to learn to swim. It will be important. I sort of liked this sequence when I first watched it, but The second time through, the idea of this little boy having to be the emotional comfort to a struggling mum felt, I don't know, icky. The fact that he was the one who had to go and calm her was wild to me, and it did feel like the show wasn't presenting her as being wrong for this. I don't know. I know the show does push this idea that nobody's truly perfect, the gods are clearly terrible parents, even Poseidon, who's seen as the best of the bunch, is implied to be a bit of a rapist in the Medusa saga. Athena decides to sentence her daughter to death for being a bit cheeky, Ares is a traitor who openly talks shit about how he hates his kids, they're all just deadbeats really. So, adding the idea that no parent is perfect and that being a single mum to a demigod would be hard, it does make sense. The scene just didn't hit for me though. It didn't let me see both sides like the stuff at the boarding school. It just made me think that this kid shouldn't have to be dealing with this. I don't like this part, and it did taint my view on her in a rewatch, I think. I hate it when kids have to play the part of grown-up, and it just doesn't work with the character we see later on. Even at the school when they argue, there's an element of being able to understand the struggle on both sides. Here for me, they pushed too hard in the other direction, and it made me kind of angry at the character and question her parenting. This then takes us to the saga with the school. Over the course of his youth in New York City, Percy starts to see things and attract attention from the world of mythology. This eventually leads to him being asked to leave his school, or just outright expelled for being troubled. Sally then tries to get him into a school outside the city, and part of this means that she has to send him away as a boarder. When told that she could homeschool Percy, she outright refuses, as we know and she knows that there are monsters and other things that would want to do him harm, and they seem to be more concentrated in the city as opposed to out here. To Percy though, it feels like a rejection from his mother. This leads to a tempestuous goodbye from the two of them with yelling and guilting and arguing. Hermes acknowledges to Percy that they'd both caused the other pain. As opposed to the pool sequence, I actually think it does work here. It showcases a number of things. The struggle of Sally being a single mother to a demigod and how hard it would be. How hard it would be for Percy, not understanding why he needs to be sent away, and how it's for his own safety and development. On top of that, it does showcase the tragic desire to keep him near her, where she can visit him sometimes and see him and talk to him, as opposed to being forced to send him to Camp Half-Blood, where he could be taken away and turned into a person more resembling his paternal family, something she's desperate to avoid because they all suck. Hence all the stories about Greek gods and the moral lessons you can learn from them. The two clash again and again over the issue, and the episode very much frames this as a struggle that Percy regrets, I suppose, as a moment where they both behaved wrong and both hurt one another. I don't know, for me it actually works, as it's showing the full strain of all her choices and the selfishness of the gods. This whole situation's torpedoed her life. Her son is being sniffed out by potentially dangerous beings. His dad could have some sort of guard system set up to protect him, but he doesn't. And she doesn't want to lose her son to Camp Half-Blood, but no other school besides this one, outside the city, is willing to take him on. It leads to stress, and since she can't explain things, he becomes upset and stressed too, feels rejected, and they clash. For me, this part works a hell of a lot better than the swimming pool section. Makes her seem flawed, yes, but it's also hard to blame her too hard for everything going on in this context. So, I think in the case of Sally Jackson, it's a mixed bag. For the most part, I do like the changes they made, but at times they push too hard in her being overwhelmed and unable to cope, to the point that she loses the compassionate vibe she had in the book, which hurts the dynamic between her and Percy in hindsight. Beyond that though, there's nothing really much else to say, and so with all that being said, these have just been my opinions, and I'd like to hear yours. What did you think of the character of Sally Jackson in Percy Jackson and the Olympians? Do you like the changes they made? Maybe not. Are you somewhere in the middle of the road like me? I'm curious of your thoughts, so make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know.